In early May 2014, the Riviera light was still flattering, still dishonest, the kind that turns concrete into pearl and makes even a hospital feel like a hotel from a distance. A woman who had spent her life collecting rent from Monaco's most expensive square meters moved through an underground car park in Nice, not in a limousine procession, not behind tinted glass, but in the ordinary geometry of ramps and columns. She was 77, dressed with the private exactness of old money, accompanied only by a driver whose name would matter only after his blood was on the ground. The place was anonymous by design. Painted lines, security cameras, the echo of footsteps swallowed by cement, yet it would become the most intimate room of her life, because everything that followed would be reduced to a few seconds. A few. Shots, a few frames of footage, that would circulate through a Daxtane principality built on discretion. Two men arrived, not as rivals, not as heirs, not as enemies with faces. They arrived as function. There were no declarations, no struggle worthy of legend, only the blunt choreography of an execution. When the sound finally came, it did not belong to Monaco's salons, or its charity dinners, or its private terraces above Larvato. It belonged to a city that has always been a border, where money from one world steps into the next and pretends it has no shadow. There are women whose power is so complete it begins to resemble absence. They do not govern with speeches or elections. They govern with leases, with signatures, with the slow certainty of ownership. In Monaco, where the land itself is an invention and every window has a price, one woman became a kind of second sovereignty spoken of in lowered voices defined by buildings rather than stories. She lived inside an empire made of reinforced concrete and inherited permissions, the sort of wealth that does not glitter because it does not need to. It arrives each month. It accumulates while its owner sleeps. It survives scandals, marriages, recessions, even beauty. And yet, at the end, the image that remains is not a palace balcony or a gala photograph. It is a fluorescent underground, a parking garage in Nice, a body collapsing beside a car, a chauffeur, Mohammed Darwish, hit so badly that he would die from his injuries days later. The woman survived longer, long enough to become a problem for everyone who needed silence. She was taken to a hospital, her name briefly printed in headlines that sounded like fiction because the story was too cruel to be plausible. The richest woman in Monaco, the so-called vice princess of the principality, gunned down, like a witness. She would die on 21 May 2014, not in her own home, not inside the walls she owned, but across the border in France, where even the wealthy must eventually submit to the ordinary bureaucracy of death. What makes this ending unsettling is not only the violence. Monaco is small enough that every violent act feels like an insult to the brand. What unsettles is the mismatch between the scale of her wealth and the thinness of her protection. The buildings associated with her name had stood for decades: La Bahia and the Emili Palace in Larvato, the Trocadero, the Continental Le Schuylkill, the Gildo Pastor Center in Fontvieille, addresses that functioned like quiet titles, converting sunlight and sea views into rent. Her fortune, estimated in the billions, was not built by invention or spectacle, but by ownership so old it felt geological. The Pastor family, founded by an Italian builder who arrived in Monaco in the 19th century, had become what people called the Principality's second dynasty behind only the ruling Grimaldus, an arrangement so stable it seemed immune to the usual threats of jealousy and politics. She had been the senior surviving figure of that dynasty, a woman whose power came from being difficult to dislodge, difficult even to define. And yet the attack did not come from markets or ministers. It did not come from a rival developer or a tenant dispute. It came close enough to be familial, intimate enough to feel like a betrayal of blood rather than a clash of interests. The first explanations in the aftermath were theatrical, organized crime, foreign revenge, business enemies, but the reality that emerged was more embarrassing because it suggested that a life designed around control had missed the one place where control is always fictional, the private sphere, where resentment grows in silence and money cannot negotiate with hate. In Monaco, the mythology of safety is part of the product. The principality sells not merely luxury, but insulation from taxes, from strangers, from the chaos that touches other places. It is supposed to be a climate-controlled world where the worst surprises are tabloid photographs and the occasional financial investigation. Her life had embodied that promise. She did not need to be loved. She needed only to be unavoidable. Her wealth was the kind that reshapes a skyline without ever appearing on a stage. She could remain almost unseen and still be everywhere because every elevator, shaft, and lobby marble carried the invisible signature of her family's century in construction. Yet in the end, the story condenses to a crude truth. A woman can own buildings and still be cornered. She can be the richest in a realm designed for the rich and still be reduced to a patient in a French hospital bed. Her empire continuing to collect rent while her body fails. The paradox is not that power collapsed. The paradox is that it collapsed into something so banal, cement a car park, two hired men suggesting that the most expensive lives can be ended with the cheapest methods, and that the final vulnerability of a powerful woman is often not public at all, but private, domestic, and already standing beside her long before the first shot is fired. Stories like hers recur with such precision that they begin to feel less like biographies and more like case studies written by history itself. Not because the women involved are identical, but because the systems that elevate them are remarkably consistent. Extreme wealth, especially inherited wealth, produces a particular kind of female power, one that is neither democratic nor performative, neither fully public nor fully private. It exists in contracts, in family boards, in legal structures designed to outlive personalities. Women who inhabit this form of power are often described as discreet, reclusive, difficult, cold, or enigmatic, as if these were personality flaws rather than survival strategies. Their authority is rarely celebrated outright. It is tolerated, negotiated around, or quietly resented. And when it fractures, the fracture is often narrated as personal failure rather than structural inevitability. The story matters because it forces an uncomfortable question: what does power actually protect, and what does it leave exposed? For men of comparable wealth, violence tends to arrive as spectacle assassinations, kidnappings, public feuds. For women, it more often arrives as intimacy turned hostile as loyalty, weaponized as family or household, transformed into threat. The social expectation that powerful women must also manage harmony to smooth tensions to compensate emotionally for their authority creates a contradiction that never fully resolves. They are expected to dominate without appearing dominant, to control without provoking fear, to inherit without claiming. When they fail at this impossible balance, the narrative quickly shifts. Power becomes arrogance, reserve becomes cruelty, caution becomes paranoia. The woman herself is reframed as the problem. In the specific ecosystem of Monaco, this dynamic is intensified. The principality is small enough that power has memory. Every family knows which other families arrived when, who built what, who married whom, and who never forgot an insult. Money here is not only currency, but lineage. It circulates through surnames, not markets. For a woman like Hélène, Pastor, power was not something to be conquered. It was something to be guarded. Her role was less about expansion than preservation, maintaining an empire assembled by previous generations, resisting dilution, avoiding fragmentation. This kind of stewardship is often invisible and thankless, especially when performed by a woman who does not perform warmth on demand. The more efficiently she does her job, the less she is noticed. Until something breaks. The central question, then, is not why she was killed. That question has an answer documented in court records and prison sentences. The deeper question is why a woman surrounded by wealth lawyers, security protocols, and historical privilege could still be rendered so defenseless at the moment it mattered most. What kind of power accumulates buildings but fails to accumulate trust? What psychological habits are formed when control is inherited rather than earned, when loyalty is assumed rather than cultivated, when silence is mistaken for stability? And more broadly, why do societies continue to romanticize female wealth as freedom while ignoring the particular vulnerabilities it produces, especially when that wealth is embedded in family structures that reward obedience, secrecy, and emotional restraint? Her story also matters because it resists easy symbolism. She was neither a revolutionary nor a socialite in search of attention. She did not trade on glamour, nor did she position herself as a victim. Her life was structured, contained, administrative. That makes the violence at its end harder to digest, because it suggests that caution is not immunity and discretion is not protection. It suggests that power accumulated slowly and legally can still provoke rage that has nothing to do with ideology or justice, but everything to do with proximity and entitlement. In this sense, her death is not merely a crime, but a punctuation mark, a moment where the narrative of safe inherited female authority collapses under the weight of unresolved resentments that had been quietly growing for years. To understand how such an ending becomes possible, one must look backward, not at the headlines, but at the formation of the woman herself, the childhood that taught her what could and could not be trusted, the family structure that trained her in vigilance rather than intimacy, the early lessons about loyalty, hierarchy, and silence. The question that will follow her story is not whether power corrupts, but whether a certain kind of power, static, inherited, emotionally armored, inevitably produces blind spots so profound that the greatest danger is never outside the gates, but already inside them, waiting patiently for its moment. Hélène Pastor was born in 1937 into a family where space, not affection, was the primary inheritance. The Pastor dynasty did not raise children to be expressive or exploratory. It raised them to be positioned. Her grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Pastor, an Italian mason who arrived in Monaco in the late 19th century, had transformed himself into the principality's most important builder by aligning construction with political loyalty and absolute discretion. By the time Hélène was born, the family no longer built houses. It controlled land. Her father, Gildo Pastor, continued this tradition, expanding the portfolio through post-war development, turning Monaco's limited territory into vertical revenue. Wealth in this household was not discussed emotionally. It was administered. Children grew up understanding that money was permanent, people were replaceable, and visibility was dangerous. Hélène's childhood unfolded inside this logic. Raised largely away from public life, she was educated with the expectation of responsibility rather than self-expression. Family accounts describe her as reserved from an early age, observant rather than demonstrative, a child who learned quickly that silence was rewarded and questions were not. Emotional warmth was not absent so much as unnecessary. In families where wealth is structural, affection is often assumed rather than practiced, and approval arrives in the form of trust, not praise. For a young girl, this produced a specific psychological calibration. Intimacy was risky, autonomy was conditional, and control was the only stable currency. She learned to read rooms quietly, to measure people not by what they said, but by what they might eventually demand. The Pastor family structure reinforced this disposition. Authority flowed downward through patriarchal lines, but women were expected to absorb pressure without complaint, to maintain continuity while remaining peripheral to decision-making theater. Hélène was not groomed to charm or to marry strategically in public view. She was groomed to endure. The absence of spectacle in her upbringing did not make her freer, it made her more vigilant. Trust was something granted sparingly and withdrawn easily. This would later be interpreted as coldness, but it originated as a rational adaptation to a world where everything of value attracted interest and interest was rarely benign. Her psychological blueprint was further shaped by early exposure to death and succession. The Pastor empire depended on continuity, and continuity depended on survival. Family elders understood that fortune without heirs was vulnerability. Hélène absorbed this lesson not abstractly, but practically, watching how estates shifted, how control tightened when someone fell ill or died, how alliances recalibrated overnight. In such an environment, grief is compressed into logistics. Loss is processed through documents. Over time, this trains a person to experience relationships as provisional and to value predictability over closeness. By adulthood, Hélène had internalized a worldview in which security came from structures, not people, and where emotional dependence was an unacceptable liability. These traits would later allow her to function with remarkable efficiency at the center of a vast property empire. They would also leave her dangerously alone when the assumptions underlying that efficiency began to fail. Hélène Pastor did not enter power through conquest. She inherited it through attrition. The Pastor fortune was not concentrated in a single iconic palace, but distributed across Monaco's most valuable districts, Larvado, Monte Carlo, Fontvieille, through residential towers, office complexes, and mixed-use developments, whose names were familiar to every resident who paid rent. Buildings like the Gildo Pastor Center, a vast commercial complex in Fontvieille housing international corporations and administrative offices, functioned less as symbols than as infrastructure. They generated steady income and political leverage without attracting unnecessary attention. To manage such assets required not charisma but endurance, not vision but control. Hélène was shaped precisely for this role. Her formal education was complemented by an informal apprenticeship in family governance. She learned property law, tenancy structures, and the delicate etiquette of Monaco's institutional relationships, how to deal with the prince's government, how to remain indispensable without appearing oppositional, how to protect assets in a sane state of manacles with a seventh jurisdiction, where proximity replaces transparency. She was never encouraged to innovate publicly. Innovation risked scrutiny. Instead, she mastered consolidation. As male relatives died without direct heirs, her position solidified. By the late 20th century, she had become the central figure holding together a portfolio estimated at several billion euros, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in Monaco, and by extension, one of its most quietly powerful. Marriage did not redefine her role. It reinforced it. Her personal life remained deliberately opaque, structured to avoid dilution of control. There was no public dynasty building through children who might fragment authority or invite legal complexity. Instead, she positioned herself as custodian rather than matriarch, a woman whose legitimacy derived from continuity, not reproduction. This choice further isolated her socially, but strengthened her legal and financial autonomy. Over time, autonomy hardened into rigidity. The systems that protected the Pastor assets also restricted her emotional bandwidth. Decisions were made through lawyers and administrators. Relationships were filtered through utility. Loyalty was assumed as a function of dependency. Specific properties anchored her authority. The Larvado beachfront buildings, among the most valuable residential zones in Europe, generated immense revenue and symbolized the family's historical role in shaping Monaco's coastline. The Gildo Pastor Center reinforced her influence beyond housing, embedding her name into the principality's commercial infrastructure. These assets were not merely sources of income, they were extensions of her identity. To control them was to justify her existence within the family narrative. Any threat to that control, legal disputes, inheritance challenges, internal dissent, was experienced not as negotiation but as existential risk. By the time she reached full command of the Pastor empire, Hélène Pastor embodied a specific kind of female power, unadorned administrative absolute within its domain, yet socially narrow. Opportunity had come disguised as duty. Authority had come at the cost of intimacy. She had been shaped not to question whether this trade-off was necessary, only to execute it flawlessly. And for decades it worked. The buildings stood. The income flowed. The dynasty endured. What remained invisible even to her was how thoroughly this formation had trained her to underestimate emotional volatility, the one force her balance sheets could not absorb. By the turn of the millennium, Hélène Pastor occupied a position that required no announcement. Her ascent had been so gradual, so administrative, that it barely registered as a change. One year, she was managing inherited holdings. The next, she was the final authority behind one of Monaco's largest private real estate portfolios. There was no coronation, no public recognition, only a subtle shift in how conversations ended when she entered a room, and how quickly decisions aligned with her preferences once her position was known. In a principality where land is the ultimate scarcity control over housing and commercial space, translated into influence that extended far beyond balance sheets. Ministers, corporate tenants, and legal advisors understood that cooperation with her was not optional. It was structural. Her daily life reflected this power in restrained ways. She did not cultivate spectacle or social dominance. Instead, she maintained a precise rhythm meetings with lawyers, property managers, and financial custodians, reviews of leases, quiet oversight of renovations that would subtly increase value without altering the visual harmony Monaco prized. Luxury surrounded her but did not define her. Residences were well appointed but not ostentatious, chosen for security and privacy rather than display. This discretion enhanced her authority. In a culture that equates visibility with vulgarity, her absence from social theater reinforced the perception that she belonged to an older, more legitimate order of wealth. Yet this ascent also deepened her isolation. Power flowed toward her, but affection did not follow. Employees deferred, advisors complied, relatives circled cautiously. The world she inhabited was efficient but emotionally thin, structured around obligations rather than relationships. Even gratitude felt transactional. She was respected but not known, admired but not approached. Over time, this produced a subtle narrowing of perspective. Feedback arrived, filtered through professional necessity. Dissent was rare, and when it appeared, it was often reframed as incompetence or disloyalty. The intoxicating quality of her power lay precisely in this smoothness, the absence of friction that might have signaled danger. Everything appeared stable because instability had been quietly excluded from the room. At the height of her authority, Hélène Pastor believed she had solved the problem her family had spent generations confronting: how to possess immense value without becoming hostage to it. She relied on legal frameworks, trusted advisors, and strict boundaries between personal and professional life. Decisions were centralized, information was compartmentalized, dependency was managed. This architecture gave her a profound sense of control, reinforced by decades in which every challenge, economic shifts, regulatory changes, family complications, had been absorbed without visible damage. The empire endured. That endurance became proof in her mind that her methods were not merely effective but correct. Early warning signs appeared quietly disguised as efficiency. Relationships were reduced to function. Emotional distance was justified as prudence. When tensions arose within her extended family, they were treated as legal matters rather than relational fractures. Loyalty was assumed to be permanent because it was paid for, institutionalized, or inherited. This assumption would later prove fatal. The belief that financial dependence guarantees allegiance ignores a darker truth: dependence can incubate resentment. Hélène dismissed this possibility not out of arrogance, but because her entire formation had taught her that people orbit money, not the reverse. Her reliance on a small inner circle further narrowed her field of vision. Trusted intermediaries insulated her from discomfort, translating reality into manageable reports. This created an echo chamber in which threats were abstract and personal emotions irrelevant. The world outside her control, envy, humiliation, wounded pride, was treated as noise rather than signal. She had mastered the visible mechanisms of power while neglecting its emotional undercurrents. The illusion of control was complete, not because she was careless, but because she had never been required to imagine a scenario in which the danger would come, not from rivals or regulators, but from someone already inside her perimeter, watching patiently as her confidence hardened into certainty. The flaw that sealed Hélène Pastor's fate was not greed or vanity, but an unexamined faith in structural loyalty. She believed that proximity to power produced obligation, and that obligation, once formalized, would neutralize resentment. This belief had been reinforced for decades. Employees stayed. Advisors remained discreet. Family disputes were settled through lawyers, not confrontation. The system appeared to work precisely because it suppressed emotion rather than engaging it. What she failed to recognize was that suppression does not dissolve feeling, it stores it. Over time, that stored resentment acquires a logic of its own detached from reason or proportion. Within her extended family, tensions had been accumulating quietly. The Pastor fortune, so stable from the outside, was internally rigid. Access to resources was tightly controlled. Autonomy was limited. For those dependent on her approval, life became a waiting room. Among them was her stepson-in-law Wojciech Janowski, a Polish aristocrat by title, but financially dependent, whose relationship to the pastor wealth was defined by exclusion rather than participation. He was close enough to observe the scale of power, yet distant enough to feel humiliated by it. Over years, this imbalance hardened into obsession. Hélène did not perceive this as a threat. She interpreted dependency as containment. The idea that someone within her orbit could transform grievance into violence did not align with her experience of how power functioned. Her fatal miscalculation was psychological rather than strategic. She underestimated the volatility of wounded entitlement. She continued to move through her routines without altering security, without recalibrating trust, without acknowledging that her authority, so absolute on paper, generated a pressure that had nowhere to go. The irreversible turn was not a single decision, but a sustained refusal to imagine betrayal as a rational outcome of her own system. When the collapse came, it did not resemble the dramatic reversals associated with fallen empires. It was procedural, almost banal. In May 2014, Wojciech Janowski hired 2 men to execute a plan that required no brilliance, only proximity. The attack in Nice was swift and inelegant. Hélène Pastor was shot multiple times. Her driver Mohamed Darwish was fatally wounded. The violence bypassed Monaco's carefully curated safety and unfolded in France, where jurisdiction diluted protection and symbolism dissolved. In the aftermath, her power became irrelevant. Buildings continued to generate income. Lawyers activated protocols. Statements were issued. But none of it altered the essential fact: she was now a patient, immobilized, voiceless, dependent on the same systems she had always controlled from a distance. Investigators quickly dismantled the mythologies surrounding the attack. There was no organized crime conspiracy, no foreign vendetta. The collapse was domestic, intimate, and devastatingly simple. Her fortune had not attracted an enemy from outside. It had incubated one within. As the trial later revealed, the planning was meticulous but emotionally driven. Janowski's resentment had fermented over years of perceived exclusion and humiliation. His conviction and life sentence would close the legal narrative, but they could not restore the illusion that wealth guarantees safety. The Pastor empire survived legally, but its moral authority fractured. Monaco, so reliant on discretion, absorbed the shock quietly, as it always does. The collapse did not echo. It settled heavy and unresolved. Hélène Pastor died on 21 May 2014 in a hospital in Nice days after the attack. She did not return to her residences. She did not oversee the transition of her assets. Her final state was defined not by ceremony, but by incapacity. The woman who had controlled space itself ended her life confined to a bed surrounded by machines, her consciousness slipping away while her properties continued their silent work of accumulation. The contrast was absolute. In death, she became briefly visible. Headlines named her fortune, her buildings, her status as Monaco's richest woman. Yet this visibility was fleeting. The principality returned to its routines. The towers remained. The rents were paid. What lingered was a quieter disturbance, the recognition that a life built entirely around control can still end in profound vulnerability. Her story leaves behind no lesson, only a question that resists resolution. How much power is required to feel safe, and how much safety is ever real? In the end, Hélène Pastor did not lose her empire. She lost the illusion that it could protect her from the human forces she had spent a lifetime managing from a distance.